Welcome to the Fane of Fantasy. This channel is all about giving you inspiration to master your craft and create fantasy that will truly immerse your audience. So, not like any or some of my previous video where it's been kind of dark around me when we've been recording, because I've been doing very late night recordings, but this time around we kind of shifted it. So my guests here are the ones doing a late night, so we're dealing with like midnight on the other end and 1 a.m. So I really appreciate that my guests here would come on in the middle of the night to do this recording. So it's early morning for me, which is this time around nice for me, I guess. But we are going to talk about how to bring your fantasy world to life, which is something that is really relevant and very good to know. So I hope we're going to get some good pointers across to you guys today in this video. But first, I'll let my guests introduce themselves here. So Geoff, maybe you'll start.
Yeah, my name is Geoff Habiger. I am a writer and author, and I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico in the United States. So.
And Coy?
My name's Coy I live in Kansas City. Well, technically a suburb of Kansas City called Lenexa, Kansas, right in the heart of the Midwest in the United States.
Cool. Yeah, and you're the one who's going on 1 a.m. So I hope you have a cup of coffee or something with you.
Yeah, if I liked coffee, that would be something. That would be
good. All right. So bringing your fantasy world to life. This was the topic you guys wanted to talk about. So what is important to know for a starting point when we want to bring a fantasy world to life?
I think for us, I mean, Coy and I write as a co-authors and everything, and we've also done prior to writing fiction. We've done role-playing games as well and everything, and created a world that we've used for campaign settings and the like and everything. Trying to bring that world to life, a lot of it was about getting a lot of the small details that were necessary to create the world and make it feel lived in, basically. And everything, and so that you would have an understanding of all of the basic little things, and leave some of the bigger things, like who the king wasn't as important as making sure you knew how the day-to-day things were going on with the common people and everything.
Not to mention the fact that you kind of would also need to know that there's a king, not even
yeah.
to know that who he is. But yeah, like Geoff said, the saying is that the devil's in the details, and that's we try to, show our support for that entire. That we try to make sure that things are, even though it's a fantasy world, things are based in reality, and you look at how a normal person lives, regardless of the fact that they're living in a world full of magic and strange creatures. The whole point is that people have to live in this world, and so that's what we want to try to make sure that we can show how these people actually live.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean that some of the people watching these videos are role players, like you just mentioned themselves. So maybe this particular thing that I'm going to mention is not as important to them as the ones who are actually writing fantasy. But how do you walk that thin line, perhaps, between sharing those kinds of details without making it an info dump on the reader?
Yeah, that is very much a very thin line to walk and everything, because you could you could do the whole Tolkien route and dump everything that you wanted to about a section in 2 or 3 chapters, and you've left your readers behind, and lost them completely and stuff, but you've gotten the information out, but it's not really done it the right way. What we've done in our fiction in the world, we've tried to integrate a lot of the information, the details and stuff, just woven it into the story, whether it's through dialogue that is going on between the different characters, small little asides to, give information about what's going on and everything. This was a first novel for this world, for this setting, so we probably had a lot more informational dumps than we would have originally liked, but we tried to always keep them brief and everything, just because you don't want to lose the reader and everything. So
yeah, absolutely. But I also I was thinking it's because I'm deep in developing the modules for a future world building course we're going to do, and we were dealing the other day with actually customs and things like that, which is also a good thing when it comes to bringing things to life and this, links to what you were talking about. But what I also were thinking about that other day when I was doing that piece of work was that trying to incorporate what are the, let's say, day-to-day challenges that people have on a day-to-day life basis, because it's very nice to paint these kind of, okay, and then these guys, I don't know, they are fishing community, and then you'll make something unique about that. Maybe there's some very strange types of fishes or whatever that they are catching, which might be very interesting. But I think where it also makes it feel more real, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this topic, but where it often feels more real is also if you can put in some of, okay, so what kind of challenges do these people have in doing their fishing, for example? Because, day-to-day life in our real world is not like everything is just nice and dandy and rosy red, and that you'll have challenges, and there are things that gonna annoy people in the setting, which doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the heroes or the protagonist. It doesn't have to do anything with the story. It's just flavor, But I don't know what you guys think about that.
No, I think we agree that, having those kinds of information is important to setting that background and that setting, and to make the world itself come to life and everything. The setting that we have, it's not so much, it's not a small village, but we also don't encompass a large, it's not a kingdom spanning or even a world spanning story. It's basically set within the confines of a large city, and everything. And so there's the day-to-day activities that everybody has to deal with, from work and all of those kinds of things and stuff. But trying to get that cultural feeling in there, a lot of it just came along with following our protagonist. Basically, when we first meet her, she's going through her kind of daily routine and everything. And so, for her, it's, going prior to going to her job, she's a constable, she's a police officer. She stops at a, we would call it a coffee house. For them, it's a cacao house. They have a huge thing for chocolate, hot chocolate and the like and everything. And, so it's setting up that setting of, here's her kind of daily routine. And you get a feel that this is kind of the routine for everybody else and everything, because it's not like this is the only shop that's in town. You get that feel that, there's lots of them around, but this is her shop. It's like her neighborhood that she goes to and everything. It's just through little scenes like that of talking about, what the characters are doing and trying to instill a little bit of the, customs and the beliefs and the thoughts that are going on with the other characters and everything. And then throwing in where we can, then the little aspects of the finer details, things like, coinage or religion or things like that, that can be fairly big topics or even small topics. And you don't want to info dump them, but you still want to create a a world that exists and everything. So.
Yes, and you still want to base it in reality, though. I mean, one of the big challenges, I think, with coming up with a fantasy world, if you're talking purely from a world building perspective, is that, you know, you're trying to come up with every piece of this entire world and being able to pull from any type of personal knowledge is a huge benefit from my perspective to say, oh, I can relate to this. So how would I then translate that into a similar thing in a fantasy world, and then start looking at putting different twists on it? So like you were talking about it in the case of a fishing village, okay, so there's some special type of fish, or maybe there's a new law that's come out that's outlawed fishing. How is this community going to handle having all of their livelihood taken away? Maybe there's some new trend in the area and this fish is now in high demand. What impact will that have fiscally on this community? So those are the types of things, you know, just thinking about it from a common sense everyday perspective can really help you get to building that world.
Yeah. And is that you guys' usual approach to when you're developing customs and stuff like that? Do you usually, let's say, use the starting point as your something with your own experiences? Is that how you usually do it, or?
A little bit of our own experience, but I also, in our setting that we've created, I've pulled a little in terms of pulling from different cultures around our own world and everything, and then just turning them a little bit, you know, maybe turning them just like 90 degrees to give them that kind of a little bit of a fantasy flair to it, and everything and stuff. So, I'm a huge reader of history. I like to follow history and everything, dabbling here and there and everything from ancient history on up. And so being able to pull various elements in and everything like that, that's kind of where the idea of, having a culture in this, this fantasy world, a city that is populated entirely, almost entirely by elves. Why do they drink hot chocolate and everything? Part of that has to do with trade within the culture and stuff, because they don't live in an area where it just naturally grows. So it's, you're building up that idea that they do have trade with outside kingdoms, outside places. But I know that historically, when the first Europeans came back from the Americas, they brought chocolate with them, and there was a huge chocolate fad in Europe at that point in time, and everything, where people would take it and make it and drink it in different ways and styles, and very bitter chocolate and various ways of doing it and everything. And so I liked that idea, and I liked putting it into a fantasy setting, and it was enough different from what our world is like today, where coffee is king and everything, and stuff. But it was something that people could still relate to as well. And everything, because most people, at least at one point in time, have probably at least had some hot chocolate, even if it's not a daily drink for them. So,
yeah, that is true, and it's funny how it often becomes this kind of ripple effect. You start with one thing, and then all of a sudden 10 other things evolve from there. In understanding cultures, and it's well, it becomes a big snowball very fast, and I think I don't know. Don't you think sometimes you need to put a bit of reins on it as well? It can kind of spin out of control, can't it? And you develop 10 million things that you don't actually need.
Yeah, very much so. I have a completely separate document that I kept as we were working on our world building and everything, where I would be writing something and I'd need to go, what's this? If I wanted to say, what is the titles of people who work in the constabulary? What are they called? And then I would go off on a tangent on a completely separate document and figure all of that out. and everything as to what were the different ranks and who are the people and the different divisions and everything for it, and that finds its way into the story, but not in an info dump and everything. And so it's very easy to get to that point where you're like, oh, I want to have all this information, and to pull yourself back and make sure you go, don't just pile it on there and do a 3-4 page dissertation on how the ranks are set up and everything in this fantasy police force and everything. But it's important for me as the writer to know what it is anyway, so that I know how to plug in those little nuggets when I need to.
Yeah. We talked a bit about the, let's say, inspiration perhaps coming initially from some own experience and stuff like that. But do you have a certain method of how you develop elements that will bring a fantasy world to life? So whether that's customs or slang people are using or whatever it is, but do you have any method for it, or how do you go about it?
So in our world, I mean, what we've created in this particular kingdom, a lot of it I took from the main race that lives there are the elves. And in most fantasy worlds, elves tend to have a background or a history that is within a woodland or a forested type area and everything. And I wanted to keep that kind of history with them, even though most of the elves now live in cities and everything. And so I actually looked at a lot of botany, terms that are used within, for different types of plants and things like that, and to try and create then, slang terms, terms that they use within the different parts of their culture. We even went so far as trying to make sure that we started to create our own idioms that people used, that were similar to what people might understand and everything, but that would be applicable to a culture that came out of living in the woods all the time and everything. How would they say certain things and everything, and stuff, so that how we might use certain idioms wouldn't be applicable because they're not set up culturally that way and everything and stuff. So trying to create those kinds of things and understanding where does the primary people, what's their history and everything, and how does that apply to the setting that we're creating.
To point out a specific example of that, using the phrase, that you're treading on thin ice, we took that and applied the feel to that to say that you're walking a narrow branch.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of bases that more in the culture and the environment of the people who live in it to try to bring those idioms to life.
Yeah, and we were last night we were watching the second season of Handmaid's Tale, where they have good examples of this. So they're doing like under his eye and stuff like that, they'll say. So they also have these kind of sayings that they have. I think at least 5 or 6 different ones that they use in different situations. But I think that sort of thing works very well. And you don't even have to explain really what it means specifically. Most of the cases you can kind of guess it just based on context.
Right.
And I think that works well because it definitely makes it feel different, even though it's really not. Maybe it's just using some other words or something like that to say hello or whatever it may be.
Exactly. I mean, and we always tried, as we were writing, especially with like creating idioms or changing idioms that people are used to, like treading on thin ice. It's very much about, in context, it's very easy to understand that, walking a narrow branch means that if you take one small slip, you're going to fall and everything. So it allows you to visualize it as the reader and understand it, which means that me and us as the writers don't have to go into an explanation, which would just kill it, would ruin it, and everything and stuff. So so yeah, very much so, having that context there and everything is good to help in terms of creating that feeling and stuff, because you want your characters to be, especially when they're doing dialogue, to have it be natural for them and everything. And if you have them say something like, oh, he's treading on thin ice, that just doesn't seem natural to a culture that comes out of a forested woodland type, history and everything and stuff. So having all of that, thinking that through, I might write an idiom and stuff when I'm doing my drafts, and then make notations in the margins and on the sides and going, this needs to change. So, because a lot of times I'll write and I don't have the time sometimes especially on the first draft to sit there and think about, oh, what would they say and everything. And I'll write out an idiom that I know, and it's like, okay, I need to change this, and I'll make a notation for it and everything. And then when we go back through and do our editing, we can fix that. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this applies to those people watching who don't write but do world building, role playing. It applies to in those scenarios as well, because what it's really about is try to envision how a character living in that sort of culture would see things. So, for example, they certainly wouldn't talk about thin ice, for example, if they live in let's say a very hot climate or something. Maybe they have never even seen ice, so for sure they would not say something like that. They would have something completely different way of saying the same thing but with different words. Or the fishing village will probably use words relating to the sea or fish or something rather than ice.
Exactly. Yes.
So it's a lot about trying to get into the head of your character and understand how they would think about things.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, very much so. So.
Yeah.
And with the role playing background that we both have, that's been our that was our first foray into gaming, was role playing, and so that's really the core of our desires, to make sure that our worlds are appropriate and thought out to make sure that we can have whether as a player or as a GM, you can make sure that the world is a living thing. The world is not just a setting, it's a character in and of its own.
Absolutely, yes. But do you see any clear differences between whether you are using it for a novel or if you're using it for some kind of role-playing setting? Do you see any clear differences, or is it more like almost the same?
For the most part, it's about the same. I mean, there's going to be some differences and everything. I mean, as a GM, I may not go into a lot of gritty detail for the player characters on certain aspects of it, unless the setting, the particular game session or campaign that they're doing calls for it and everything. Whereas I may, in terms of my writing, I'll at least try and figure out like certain backstory information and things like that may not even crop up, but I want to make sure that I understand the history of what's going on and everything, so that that it makes sense to me and everything. But there is always going to be a little bit of overlap that way as well and everything, because what both people are doing, whether you're a writer or somebody who is doing role playing, you're creating a world, and like Coy said, you want to try and make that world feel lived in and everything, and not just a cardboard cutout that people are standing in front of and everything. You want them to be able to interact, whether that's the players interacting with the non-player characters or the reader interacting with the different characters that you've created in your story.
Yeah, when the adventuring party goes into town and they decide they're going to go to the tavern, the tavern probably has a name, So does the bartender. So does the serving girl. The patrons have names. Why are they there? What's important about them? All of those are details that, theoretically should be important. If they're not important, then okay, it may not be important to you in this particular time at this particular adventure, but maybe you could use it later. So maybe it's something you would want to explore, looking into detailing some things out that you may not have thought of before.
And that is actually probably a very good example on where there are some differences, because if you're in role playing, I think if you in the tavern, the bartender has names, the serving maid has name, and you can talk to her, and it can kind of go where it needs to go. It doesn't matter too much. Whereas in a novel, if you shine the light on the serving maid starting to tell about a story that something happened yesterday or whatever, the reader will automatically think, oh, this is important, I better pay attention. And if it's just kind of something that you just threw in there because, well, it gives a bit of flavor, you're kind of misdirecting the reader. So that, I think that is certainly one part where there are differences. Whereas the role player, he can start asking her about all kinds of things, and maybe something develops from there, and it doesn't really matter at all.
Right. Well, and I think part of it, is certainly the one benefit of it from a writing perspective is in terms of writing a novel or a story or whatever. We tend to control a little bit better the characters, as opposed to a role-playing session where the GM can try and control the characters, but you're dealing with lots of people and their own ideas and the best laid plans of GMs and everything. You've got everything figured out, and there's the adventure that they want to do or you want to do, and to get them going, and they wind up talking to everybody in the bar and decide to go completely someplace else and everything. And so yeah, I mean, in that sense, if I put something into the story, there might be just a bit of an internal dialogue, but the fact that I introduce a character and I have an in-depth interaction generally means that there's something going to be leading from it, as opposed to in a role-playing game, they could be having a long conversation and trying to figure out from the guy that's sitting in the corner that has nothing to do with what the GM wants to get done. So, and everything. And while everybody may have fun with that, and inevitably a bar fight will probably break out, it may not be exactly what the GM wants to get done. So
no, indeed.
I've never had that happen in my sessions. Never.
No. I'm sure.
Not today.
Yeah, not today.
Yeah. Okay, so we've tried to touch a bit about or on different topics or elements that you can use to bring your world to life, and it's more like it's kind of the iceberg thing. This stuff, it's just hinting at stuff that you haven't even developed necessarily, but just hinting at something other is behind the horizon that you can't see. That's sort of the thing that brings the world to life. And we've talked about the culture, the slang, and idioms, and that sort of thing. But is there anything else we need to mention before we close off, in that is important when we want to bring the world to life?
I would say, especially when you're talking about a fantasy world, we've talked about, like you said, about the culture, about those kinds of things, and everything. Understanding, and I know you've done other things specifically on topics of magic, but knowing what your magic system is, and everything, whether you're doing a role-playing game or whether or not you're, doing, writing, and for fiction or whatever, knowing the basics of that system and how the magic interacts and stuff from a role-playing perspective. Yes, there's the whatever game system you have, and they have their rules for it. But really, how does it work, and how do people interact with it? In most fantasy settings, you're going to have some kind of magic, and everything. So I would just say that it's important, as the person who's crafting the world, to really think about all of the little details that go into it and everything, and how they're going to interact with everybody, and everything. And it doesn't have to be dissertation length, multi-chapter books written about your world, unless you really want to do that. But you know, it just needs to be a few simple notes and everything to say, you know, people call coins this. People use these kinds of terms when talking about things. You know, this is how people react to magic and everything. You know, this is a place that is ruled by a king, and he's a fairly decent guy. You know, and those kinds of things and stuff, or he's a tyrant. You know, at least having that kind of basic information at hand, so that when those situations crop up in the book or the role-playing session or whatever, you're at least ready for them.
That's a good point, because the fact that you have thought a bit about it ahead of time also prevents you from defaulting to your standard way of what you think people, how they would react, which would then be the same all the time. But if you paid a bit of attention to it and thought a bit about it, you can make it feel more real as well, because people will act different, and perhaps in one city they react differently than in another city because of whatever. But you can certainly bring things more to life by just pay a bit of attention to some basic stuff, like you say. I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
All right. So if people want to find out more about you guys, where do they go?
So they can find out about us. We have our author website. It's all one word. It's habigerkazee.com. And that's where we have all the information about our novels, as well as our own writings and things like that. If they're interested in us for any kind of game stuff, because we do still do our role-playing games and things like that for supplements for different systems, that's through our website is called tangent-games.com. So it's tangent and then a hyphen games.com. And everything. So that's where they can find out the most information about us and everything. Although they can try and search us on Twitter or on Facebook as well. So.
All right. Yeah. Cool. And of course, I will put the links to all the stuff that Geoff just mentioned in the comment section below, so you guys can go and check it out there. But I want to thank you guys for coming on the channel for this conversation, even though it's in the middle of the night for you guys and it's work day tomorrow morning, I think. So so thanks for that.
Thank you for having us. We were happy to come on. So
very cool. You taking the time to have us join you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. And also for you guys out there, thank you for watching today. And you can, of course, also support this channel if you want. There is a link down in the description field below as well, where you can find out more about some rewards you can get over on Patreon. But other than that, then all there is left to say is stay safe out there, and see you next Monday.